Good evening. My name is Christina Sid, and I'm the Director of Programs at the High Desert Museum. Thank you for joining us tonight for our first Natural History Pub of the season. While I know we all miss being together in person for these informative and inspiring programs, I'm glad that we can meet virtually as we explore more about key topics in the High Desert and beyond. I'd like to extend our gratitude to the Pacific Northwest Forest Service Association, also known as Old Smokies, for supporting Natural History Pub. And tonight we're in for a real treat as we hear from Jay Wilde as he shares the story of bringing Beaver back to Birch Creek. Jay Wilde ranches on the ranch that he grew up on in southeast Idaho. Jay left the ranch when he graduated from high school to go to college, and he got married twice, raised a family, and pursued a career. He was away from the ranch for 30 years, but always had an urge to return to the land and lifestyle that was in his blood. After his parents passed away and the ranch was in a family trust, Jay decided to return and buy out his siblings and take over the ranch. When he returned, he found things quite different from what they were during his childhood. Birch Creek, the once perennial stream that flowed throughout the ranch, was now flowing intermittently and was dry by midsummer. It finally hit him that maybe the absence of beavers in the watershed was contributing to the demise of the stream. He started researching the role of beavers, that beavers play in the watershed, and the more he learned, the more it made sense that for a watershed to function properly, there needs to be beaver there. His story tells of all of his efforts to bring beaver back to Birch Creek and the effects that they've had. And in just a minute, I'll turn it over to Jay, and you'll learn more about his work. I also want to say that he'll have a presentation, and at the end, we'll have a time for question and answer. So please do feel free to put your questions in the chat function or the question and answer function, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the program. And now I turn it over to Jay.
Thank you, Christina. And it seems funny to me that you'd have recruit a cowboy from Idaho to come to the Beaver State to talk about beaver. Here we are, and it's a fun story for me to tell, and I appreciate the chance to share it with the people here in Bend. This is what we're going to talk about. I'll talk a bit about my history and the history of the watershed. Talk some about hydrology problem and the evolution of the grazing practices. One thing about the beaver restoration, if you don't have the grazing right, it's probably not going to work. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about that and how what we do on our deeded ground is actually bled across the fence line to the Forest Service, and we're doing some of that work on the forest. Speak a little bit about what I tried to do on my own as far as the hydrology. Then what about beaver and BDA assisted restoration, what we did to make that happen. Okay, this is where we're at. If you look over here in the extreme southeast corner of Idaho, between Preston and Montpelier, our ranch is up in the mountains there. Well, this is in the extreme northeast corner of the Great Basin in the Bear River watershed. And we summer our cows there. We're there from May until November. And then we move them way out west between Twin Falls and Boise at Glens Ferry, down along the Snake River down there. Elevation down there at Glens Ferry is 2,500 feet. The elevation at the summer ranch is starts out at 5,300 feet, and it goes up to about 8,000. So the climate is much milder in Glens Ferry for wintering cows, and we're able to just winter out with them there. Okay, this is outlined in red there. That's the Birch Creek watershed. Birch Creek is a tributary to Mink Creek at the very bottom, the peak down there. That's where Birch Creek empties into Mink Creek, and then Mink Creek in turn empties into the Bear River. And the Bear River eventually gets to the Great Salt Lake, part of the Great Basin drainage. What you see in the foreground there is the Bear and Narrows, and Pacific Corp has a hydro plant there. There's a reservoir and a hydroelectric plant there. So this watershed, our ranch sits right at the mouth of that canyon in the center. We've got about 600 acres of deeded land there, and it butts up to the Forest Service in those mountains above the ranch. And this is where I grew up. I spent most all my free time in those mountains, hiking, horseback riding, hunting, fishing, usually some kind of a adventure that we had going. And I got really attached to those mountains and that country. And I stayed here when I left. When I graduated from high school, I left. And I was actually gone for 30 years, but the lifestyle in the country just never got out of my blood. And after 3 or 4 years, I always wanted to go back. Now, that took me 30 years, but I finally made it back. In 1995, I went back. So what I found was a stream that was dry by midsummer. Birch Creek was always a perennial stream when I was growing up there. And in 2007, it was dry by June 14th. The old maps shows Birch Creek as a perennial stream. The blue line. Those are some ephemeral tributaries. But eventually, and I think this was in 1980 is when they did a visual look at it, and the reach in the middle there became intermittent. So you see water on the right there, that's the headwaters. So we do have flow up there. And then on the left there's a big spring where that line turns blue. So we do have water from there down, but that's on the very bottom end of the ranch. So coming out of the forest and down through most of the ranch, we just have an intermittent stream anymore. I started recording the dates when the stream dried up, and we plotted it on this graph. If we look at the day of the year, 180 days would be July 1 over on the left. The bottom, that represents snow water, snowpack water, and May precip, spring precip. And we plotted that on there, and then we came up with that line, that dotted line, that predicts when the stream will go dry. So if we look at it, what our precip is, then we can follow it back over to the time. We can pretty well predict when the stream is going to go dry by how much precip we've had. So I had in my mind what was wrong, and I really still think it's a big part of it. But I was having trouble convincing anybody, so I started taking photos. And the photo on the upper right there, I took that 8:30 in the morning on June the 18th. And I came back 12 hours later in the same place, took that photo, there wasn't any flow. I went back the next morning, same place, and the water's flowing again. 12 hours later, that same day, it was dry again, or had stopped flowing. There's another example where we had a lot of water in the morning, dry in the evening. So, what's going on here? I'm not much of an artist, but I put this together to illustrate evapotranspiration. This is the riparian. Those are all cottonwood trees. Cottonwood trees are notorious for sucking up a lot of water out of the water table. So I was convinced that evapotranspiration, ET, was the big culprit why our stream wasn't running. This photo was taken in May while we still had flow. Now, the more I kept looking at evapotranspiration, I kept bumping into this concept, interception. I took that photo up there above the ranch, and it had been raining off and on for 3 days. And you can see underneath that Engelmann spruce that, it's still dry. So that's a pretty good example of what interception amounts to. I was curious about precip. So a few years back, I put this graph together, and it's interesting because I showed this to one group, and a guy came up to me after, and he says, "I loved your graph. It looked like it was you drew it by hand." Well, I'm from the old school. That's the only way I know how to do it. So I put it together. The pink line is snowpack. We plot snowpack on the left, or precip, water, on the left, and on the bottom is the year. So the pink line is the snowpack moisture. The black line is total precip. That I can only find that data for back 30 years. But it's pretty obvious that the total precip pretty much parallels what our snowpack moisture is. We actually get most of our precip, or a high percentage of it, in the form of snow. Oh, we talk about a normal year. What's normal? That I don't see anything there that's very normal. I plotted, the green line is the average on the snowpack. And that still doesn't really tell me much because we just don't have many years where we're on that line. I thought maybe I'll plot the decades. So that's what those blue lines are. And you can see it bounces up and down above and below average even then. And out here on the end, we've got a trend. The last 40 years, we saw less precip every year, or every 10 years. I haven't extended the graph, but I figured the average from 2010 to 2019, the average was 22.75, and that's a little above what that farthest to the right blue line is. So we had a little bit of a rebound in the decade from 2010 to 2019. Now 2021 rolls around, and you can see we're in a drought over there too. So our snowpack moisture is 66% of the average. Total precip is at 64%. So yeah, we're having a drought over there too. We have had some precip this year. Mid-August, we had a couple of pretty good storms. That's really unusual. We don't usually get much much fall precip until mid-September. But this year we got some in August. So with the erratic precip and everything, it became obvious to me that the stream flow was, I couldn't depend on it for stock water. So we had one area on the ranch, there was some small springs, a complex of springs or seeps basically is about all they were. And I thought if I could get those developed and get it piped into a system where I could put it into troughs, and that way I could have stock water. And we used these, they're called easy flow, and they're actually designed for septic drain fields. And what they are is styrofoam nuggets or pellets, and they're enclosed in a mesh wrap, and then they have a perforated pipe in the middle of them. So we dig out the seep and the spring. We put these easy flows in the trench. It's just like if you was using gravel. Well, that's basically what it is synthetic gravel. And we cover it up with, cover them up with plastic, with visqueen. In that lower left picture, you can see where we got them covered up. That's so they don't get filled up with dirt from above. And then coming out of those, we have a pipe coming out of them, and we put a bentonite dam in the trench, so the water has to get into our system. When we brought it into this concrete box, you can see 3 pipes coming in on the left. That comes from 3 separate sources. The pipe going out on the right, that goes to our system, and the big pipe coming toward us, that's the overflow. So anything that's not being used in the system overflows out through that pipe into a pond that we built. And in the upper left there, up in that timber, there's where those seeps were. We brought them down out of that, across that field and across the canyon, and the picture on the upper right, clear down to where we have a set of corrals. It was 7,000 feet from the source to the end of the system. And there was enough elevation drop that we ended up with 160 PSI in that system. So we had to use 200 PSI pipe. That's what's on that reel. And we used recycled earth mover tires for troughs. We put in 4 different troughs in strategic spots. They take these tires and they grind the rubber off of them and recycle them, and then they sell them for people to make water troughs out of. So you come up in the center with your plumbing and then pour the center full of concrete, and you end up with a pretty durable water tank. Okay, now we're going to talk about what we're doing with our grazing. And I've always been partial to roan horses, and this guy, he's been pretty special. I still ride this horse, so he's been a good one. But the important part of this picture is that fence line contrast right there. All that brown stuff on the right side of that fence, that's the neighbor's property. And that's Wyethia amplexicalis. The common name, I believe, is mule ear duck. And this fence, that's the first thing I did when I went back in 1995, was I built that fence. Before then, the neighbors and we together used that country just in common. Both sides got grazed the same, and both sides at that point, the whole thing looked like the neighbor side does. So what you're seeing there is we didn't do any seeding, we didn't plant any grass, we didn't do any chemical treatments, and we didn't do any mechanical treatments. It's all been accomplished by how we manage our grazing. Well, a friend of mine got me interested in Alan Savory's approach to resource management, holistic resource management. And part of that was this idea of intensive grazing. What that amounts to is you put a large amount of cattle on a small area, but you don't stay very long, and then you move. So we had, I think, 140 cow-calf pairs, 20 or 25 yearling heifers, and 8 or 10 bulls. And we were on this deal. This is about 7 or 8 acres, and we were there just a little over a day, and then we moved. And then we stay off of this. You have to leave. You have to give it a chance to recover. So we're gone actually all summer. And it'll recover. And we'll come back in the fall after seed set and dormancy, and we'll graze it again in the fall. But we're gone all summer. This is what it looks like when we move the cows. This is back at that fence line contrast. And you can see the crust that develops underneath the snowpack in certain soils, especially right here. This is a kind of a clay soil, but that crust gets really hard. And this intensive grazing breaks that crust up. You can see most of the decadent material has been tromped down and pretty much incorporated into the soil. The other thing we see is concentration of dung and urine, which amounts to fertilizer and microbe additions to the soil. I took this picture, this is in the same spot, it's just looking 90 degrees to the left. This picture was taken the 1st of August. So you can see the recovery that we get. Now I had, let me back up here. Right there across that fence, that's our Forest Service allotment. And I had the Forest Service range con that's over the allotment and her boss, and we were doing an inspection on the allotment. We rode up across there, and I pointed out that fence line contrast and explained to him what we had done there. And the range con, her boss, he piped up and he says, "Jay, what do we got to do on our side of the fence to make it look like your side?" So, you know, that's a compliment coming from an agency person. That's anyway, I told Kevin, I says, you know, Kevin, we just can't do that on the forest because this is actually considered winter range, and we're limited to 45% utilization on a winter range, and we have to exceed that. If we're going to get the results that I've gotten on my deeded property, we have to exceed that. So anyway, I just kind of wrote it off. But a couple of weeks later, Kevin called me and he says, "Jay, if you can get your association to go for it, you're willing to put the fences in and do the management, Forest Service will go along with it, but we got to call it an experiment. And we'll commit to it for 5 years to see if it works." So I went to the association and I was okay with it. And we put in some fences and we set up these line intercept transects so we could track the density of the Waiithia. We had 3 of those transects, and in 2010 is when we started, and you can see what the results are. In 2010, 25.4%. Now we've got it down to 3.1%. Transect 3, 38.1 to 3.7. Transect 4, 64.4 to 8.8. And we've got it down to the point where this year we were a little lower on those percentages than we were last year. But last year, there was 2 of them that was a percentage point or 2 higher. So I think we've got it to the point where it's probably going to stay. The Waithia is a native plant, so it's supposed to be there. But I guess what they're blaming it on is the early part of the 20th century, the overgrazing is why the Waithia has taken over these lower ranges. So it's supposed to be there, but it's not supposed to be dominant. So I think that's probably where we're at. We're starting to see these percentages bounce a little. Okay, a little on the history of the grazing on the Forest Service allotment. Early in the last century, up until the 60s, the season it turned out mid-May, came home the 1st of September. There wasn't a lot of management. Most people just put them through the gate and went home, and they just felt lucky to be rid of the cattle for the summer. So where the cattle spent the summer was right on that riparian corridor. A little bit up some of those canyons, but for the most part, they just really hammered that riparian zone. And you can imagine it was in pretty tough shape. And in 1966, Forest Service rolled in, and they shut the allotment down. They told everybody, you got to keep them home. You got to keep cattle off this deal for 3 years. So when the grazing resumed, they'd cut the permits almost in half, cut the grazing season in half, and it was still the season-long grazing, and for the most part in the riparian zone. So it didn't really do a lot of good. So anyway, we were continually in trouble with the Forest Service, and I kept telling these guys, we got to do something. It's we're going to lose this allotment if we don't do something. Oh, anyway, I griped enough that in 2003 they made me president of the association. So anyway, thanks, guys. But we started doing a lot of riding. We built fences and developed water, built ponds, fixed some of the old water systems that fed water troughs. And we started concentrating our efforts to keep the cattle in the uplands, keeping them out of that riparian. When we started the intensive grazing deal, we ended up with three pastures on the forest there that we do the intensive grazing. We moved through them pretty fast. That one about 3 days. That one lasts us 10 days to 2 weeks, and this one about the same. Now, once we're through there, then we basically go to just a conventional grazing system where we scatter the cattle out, keep them in the uplands. And we're in that pasture for probably about 3 weeks, and then we move over here, and this is 10 days or 2 weeks. And then we move to the high country, and up here we're between 7,500 feet and 8,000 feet. And once you get the cattle up there, they like it. They like it up there. It's cool, and the feed is later, or it's more lush and younger. By the time we get out of that lower country, most of that feed's getting pretty rank. So the cattle stay up there pretty good. They will trickle down here where the star is. That's the headwaters of the watershed, and we'll get some cattle that'll start trickling in there. we get too many, we'll grab them and put them up above again. But for the most part, they stay up there pretty good. And when we're coming home with the cattle, we actually will gather that high country and take those cattle all the way out. But we don't get them all, and there'll be some that'll be following us, and they will be grazing down that riparian. But well, by the time they're there, everything is seed set and pretty much gone dormant. It's still green, but it's done growing and it's done its thing. So we don't use it very hard, and it doesn't see much damage. So, and then we spend the fall back on our deeded land. So just to review, the early pre-65 grazing was a long season with a lot of cows. They shortened it up to a shorter season, but we still didn't have very good management, cut the numbers. And now the way we're operating, we turn out the 1st of June, and we come home mid-September. We're just in the process of coming home with them now. The other thing that's important here is you notice the different kind of cattle. Back in the early days, everybody that had permits on the forest had a little dairy herd. And it ended up being the offspring of those dairy animals that ran on the allotment. Most of them Holsteins, a few Jerseys and Guernseys. Now we're running stock cows, mostly Black Angus, and the stock cows are a lot more aggressive when it comes to rougher country and higher elevations. They tend to hustle a little better. So it's working well for us now. This is a DMA, a designated monitoring area on the allotment, and I started monitoring here in 2001. And at that time, all we were doing was measuring the stubble height along the green line, right along the water's edge. And we were supposed to have, at the end of the growing season, this is in October, we're supposed to have 6 inches of stubble height there. And you can see we're in trouble. We don't have 6 inches. In 2002, it's a little better, but we still don't have our 6 inches. 2003, no. And this was my first year as being president, and that one ATV that's up there, that was a Forest Service feller. And when we got done doing this monitoring, I got my butt chewed. So I just made up my mind, we're going to have to do something different. And that's when we started pushing the cattle back to the high country and getting things set up so we could keep them there. 2004, this is the first year that we really put much effort into keeping them out of there. We got our 6 inches of stubble height. 2005, again we've got our stubble height. We're in compliance, and watch right just off the top of that steel post what's starting to happen there. In 2006, 2007. In 2007, we started doing what they call a MIM protocol on the monitoring, multiple indicator monitoring. And it looks at a lot more indicators than just stubble heights. We look at species composition on the green line. We do measure stubble height, but we look at the species composition. We look at stream bank disturbance, stream bank stability, stream bank cover. There's a whole raft of things that we look at when we do this MIM protocol. So here, 2008. Again, it looks pretty good. 2009. In 2010, and this was one of those years when we was able to keep all the gates closed, and cattle guard wasn't full of dirt. you know, we was able to keep the cattle out of here all summer. So I took it on myself. I thought I was sure that of the evapotranspiration deal. I was so sure of that deal and how notorious those cottonwoods were. And that polygon there on the left, that's a grove of cottonwood trees right along the creek. The stream runs right down through the middle of that photo, next to the road, and then crosses under the road. But there was water running into that grove of cottonwood trees and nothing coming out. So I decided I was going to cut them all down. And I had some reservations because I thought the government regulations and everything wasn't going to allow me to do that. But I decided to go ahead and do it anyway. So I started about noon on Friday, and by Sunday evening, see, those government guys, they take the weekend off, so they're not going to be around to stop me. But by Sunday evening, I'd cut down about 60, and some of those cottonwoods were huge. I had a 36-inch bar on my chainsaw, and I had to cut some of them from two directions to get them down. And I just went in there with my cat and skidded them out, and I kind of made a mess. It didn't look too good. But Monday morning, the water was running on down the stream to the next patch of cottonwoods, and that's where it stopped. So anyway, I'd proved my point. But also Monday morning, there was a guy from the Department of Lands showed up. We'd been doing some logging on another part of the ranch, and the Department of Lands in Idaho, they oversee logging even on private land. So he come to do, we had finished, and he came to do his final inspection, and he saw I'd actually logged up some of those straighter, cleaner cottonwoods, and I hauled them to a sawmill and had them sawed into planks. They were piled up there, and so he was asking about that and but it was a private operation. They were my trees, and I did the work, and they were going to be for my use. So he didn't really, I guess he didn't have any authority because it wasn't a commercial operation. But and I don't know for sure, but I think he went back to his office and blew the whistle. And because a day or two later, I had Idaho DEQ, and I had a Department of Water Resources, and I had the Corps engineer all there looking at the mess I had. And I was in pretty deep trouble. And it went on for a while. But the guy that I ultimately had to deal with was at the Department of Water Resources. And he told me, he says, Jay, I got a lot bigger fish to fry than you. If you'll agree to do 4 things, then this will all go away. So I jumped on it, I thought, and 3 of those things I was going to do anyway. One of them was I had to clean up the slash. I had to plant it to all the disturbed areas. I had to plant to a perennial mix of grasses and forbs. And I had to fence it long enough, keep it fenced long enough for it to recover. The 4th thing was I have to stay away from the creek. I've got to stay 50 feet away from that creek from now on. So anyway, the $10,000 fine went away, and I was out of trouble. But the thing of it is, I had proved my point about the cottonwoods and the ET. So, the government, they've shut me down on cutting down cottonwood trees. And the Forest Service, most of this watershed's on the Forest Service. So they're not going to let me go up there and clean out the cottonwoods and do any of that kind of stuff. And so I couldn't get it out of my mind that I had to do something to get this stream back to being a perennial stream. I'm sitting on my kitchen table one morning in 2006. waiting for the caffeine from that first cup of coffee to kick in. And it dawned on me, there were no longer beavers in the watershed like there were when I was a youngster and that stream ran perennial. And I wondered, could it be that the beavers has got something to do with it? And could it be that I'm going to have to change my mind about beavers if there's anything to it? Because I grew up hating them because they were always in our irrigation ditches and plugging culverts and flooding roads. And, we just thought they were a nuisance, and we did what we had to get rid of them. Well, anyway, I started researching beavers and their effect on the hydrology in a watershed. And the more I learned, the more it made sense. In order for a watershed to function properly, you need to have beavers there. So I went to Forest Service and I asked them, I said, can we put some beavers back in there? This was the last dam that was there. As near as we can tell, this picture was taken sometime in the 80s. We don't really think that it's active at the time this photo was taken. The water level has receded some, and we don't see any fresh cuttings or peeled sticks. But that was the last dam in the watershed. Now, I went and took that picture on the right, stood in the same place that picture on the upper left was taken. That's the recovery that we've had. And that you can't really see much, so I decided, well, I need to get something for a reference. So I went and got up above the road and took the lower photo, and that big spruce tree there behind those cottonwood limbs that's sticking out in front of it, that's the same one that's in the extreme upper corner of the other photo here with the old dam. So you can see what's happened with the woody species since the beavers were there in the 80s. So I went to the Forest Service, and they finally gave me the go-ahead in 2008. And in 2008, I got 6 beavers from the government trapper. And they were just random nuisance beavers that he caught here and there. And we put them in, but I never did see a beaver dam. Never did see much sign of, once in a while you'd find a tree that was been chewed on a little bit, but there was no sign of a complex. So in 2009, I got 7 more and put them in. And the same thing, nothing happened. They either left or they were got by the lions or the coyotes. We don't know whether it was predation or whether they just left or whether they died. We don't know. Oh, it became pretty obvious to me I didn't know what I was doing as far as relocating beavers. So I kept reading and studying and learning about it. And this went on until 2014. And I was reading an article about some guys at Utah State University that had pretty good luck relocating beavers using BDAs, beaver dam analogs. So I thought, I need to get a hold of those guys. Joe Wheaton, I sent him an email, looked him up on the directory at Utah State and sent him an email. And he answered me right back, and he wanted to come and have a look. So these guys on the left in that right-hand picture, they're from Utah State. That's Joe with his hand out there. And I had some Forest Service people there. And we talked it over and decided, let's put a plan together and try and get some beaver back in this watershed. So part of that plan is to build BDAs, but you can't build BDAs without permits. In Idaho, you have to get a stream alteration permit, and that's through the Department of Water Resources and the Corps of Engineers. Plus, we had to get it past the district ranger. We had to get him to go along with what we were proposing. And the district ranger at first, he allowed us to get started, but then he got cold feet, and he wasn't going to let it happen. And so I'd got acquainted with Brett Roper, and he's at Utah State too. He heads up the ecology lab there. But he's actually a Forest Service employee, and he's not a district employee, and he's not a region person. He actually, I think, might be a Washington, D.C. Forest Service person, but he packs a lot of weight in the agency. And so these other guys, and Brett and I, we went to Montpelier, the Forest Service office. That's where our district office is. Sat down at the conference table, and there were 5 or 6 Forest Service people there. And Joe explained to him the science about it all and what we intended to do. And then Brett, thankful for Brett, he spoke up and he says, okay, I know these guys, I know what their work is, I know what they do. I'm willing to take responsibility for this project as far as the Forest Service goes. So that got everybody off the hook as far as all the local people. The district ranger, he let it proceed. So we had the green light. These guys at Utah State, they've put together this model that it's called BRAT, Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool. And it identifies good beaver habitat or bad beaver habitat. It'll estimate what that habitat, how many dams it will support. And it also identifies infrastructure and places where the beavers could be a problem. But anyway, the Brat and Birch Creek looked really good. So we went ahead with a pilot. This was our goal, was to restore perennial flow or at least make it less intermittent. We had abundant forage, shallow water depth, high risk of predation. That's those beavers need those ponds. And we had been unsuccessful. So our strategy was to build BDAs to provide immediate habitat refuge for beaver. And the way having a pond, we think of beavers and the beaver pond, that's just a place for them to swim around and play. But actually, that's their whole defense mechanism. They have to be able to get into the water to get away from predators. And they actually have their lodges, the entrance to their lodge is actually underwater. And that pond creates a place where they can have a food cache for winter, so they can access food underneath the ice on the pond. So they're just a lot more comfortable if they have a pond. So we built that same fall in 2014. We built 4 BDAs in 2 different places. We needed to know from this pilot, we needed to know if they'd hold up to the high flows in the spring. And we needed to know if they would froze solid through the winter. So we had temp loggers in those ponds, and they didn't freeze, and they held up to the high flows. So we went to work and built some more. The BDA construction amounts to, up there in the left-hand corner, you can see some guys with a yellow gadget. That's a hydraulic post pounder, and we pound those 3-inch posts into the stream bed. Those are 3-inch peeler cores, untreated. And that's the support for the BDA. And then you take willows and small tree limbs and you weave them amongst those posts. And then we put mud on the upstream side of those willows and limbs to seal it off and actually create a pond. And it's really not much different than an actual beaver pond. Most of the materials, all but the post, is just accessed whatever's local there, whatever's close. The mud we get, we try and get that out of the area that's going to be inundated by the pond. In 2015, after the pilot had told us that, yeah, they're going to work, we built 15 more BDAs. And then in October 2015, Idaho Fish and Game brought us 5 beavers. And they came from Slug Creek, that's about 75 miles away. And we relocated them in actually at one of the pilot BDA sites. Beavers are certainly a keystone species. Relative to their abundance, they have a tremendous effect on a whole lot of other critters. And I don't care, all the way from fish to moose. The beaver will create habitat for them. Not to mention the vegetation that changes when the beavers around those beaver complexes. In 2016, NRCS they got excited about what we were doing. Jeremy Maestas from here in Bend actually works for the NRCS, National Resource Conservation, and he put this workshop together, and he brought people in from all over the West. And most of these people are supervisory people in the NRCS, and they learned how to build BDAs. They actually built 3 BDAs, another complex on the main stem, and then we moved up into a tributary, Mill Hollow, and built 3 or 4 more. Actually, and didn't use posts. We built those without putting posts in the ground. So this is that crew. And the exciting part about this photo, for me, you read up there at the top, 3 generations. The guy there with the cowboy hat on in the front, that's my son. And the girl off to his left, our right, and the black sweatshirt, that's his daughter. That's my granddaughter. So, when I'm gone, these folks, they still care enough about this to get involved in it. And it's exciting for me to see that they're interested in carrying on what I've started. This, I mentioned that we built some BDAs without posts, and there was a certain argument that ensued here between the scientists and the ologists. I call them ologists. That they wanted to try to build a BDA without using posts, because if you're going to drive posts, you got to get all that heavy equipment in there, and if we can build them without posts, it eliminates that. We don't have to drag the posts in there or all that equipment. So they built this little BDA without any posts, and that red line is the elevation that BDA was. It had water backed up about maybe 1/2 meter deep. And we released beavers in that BDA, and in a month and a half, they raised that dam clear from that red line up to the top there. So they liked it. This is, we released 4 more beavers in 2016. Actually put them in 2 different spots. We didn't have any BDAs built yet when I got the first 2, and I put them in a stock pond up on the top there, and then we released the other 2. They all came out of the same complex. They just come a few days apart, and I think they got together. That's part of getting the beavers to stick. They'll tell you that if you can keep that family unit intact, they're more likely to take to a new home. But we released 4 beavers in 2016, and they come from basically the same area, just a different complex. And this is a drone view. That maps our valley bottom. The blue line through there, that was the original stream. And it's not a very big stream. There is not a lot of water there, but a couple feet wide and 3 or 4 inches deep. We put those BDAs in where the yellow lines are. Those were BDAs. We put the beavers in, and the red lines is how the beavers expanded those BDAs and created that complex of ponds. And now the overflow from those ponds is now saturating that whole valley bottom almost. So just to kind of summarize how it's all happened. In the 70s, we had beavers there. In the 90s, I moved back, and no beavers, and the creek's drying up. 2008 and 9 is when I made the attempt to reintroduce beavers. 2014, keep in mind this is 2006 is when I came up with this idea that we need to put beavers in there. So in 2014 is when I got hooked up with the guys at Utah State. 2015 was when we did most of the treatment as far as BDAs go. In 2015, the fall, is when we put the first 5 beavers in. 2016 is when the NRCS course was there and built some more BDAs. And then 4 more beavers. So from 2006 is when I first came up with the idea that we needed beavers, and it was the fall of 2015 before I saw the first beaver dam. Hey, this is some of the results. The beavers stuck around. They utilized most of the BDAs, built dams of their own. The picture on the right, you can see those posts sticking out of the water. That was a BDA. But the beavers built a dam just below it and built it up and flooded out our BDA. They didn't like where we'd put it, so they built their own dam. These dams, these photos on the bottom, those are all dams, the ponds that they created on their own. There were no BDAs there. Some of the BDAs, it takes them a while, and some of them before they start using them. But, this one took 2 years. This is back at that MIM site, and when we were building those BDAs, I wouldn't let those guys build any BDAs in this meadow is we've been doing all that monitoring, and I felt like we'd really made a lot of progress there, and I didn't want to see it flooded. Well, the Beavers had a better idea. So, and it's okay. We've got all that previous year's data on the vegetation and that, so we're able now to track the changes in the vegetation, and it's been pretty neat. Oh, this is that meadow. There's down the picture on the right. There's half a dozen dams down through that meadow. The picture on the upper left, that's actually at the very bottom end of that meadow. That's a pretty huge dam down there. This is a drone picture of that meadow, and you can see what during the high flows in the spring of the year, what those beaver dams, and in some cases, we had one BDA that was helping to flood this. Up above that two-stemmed fir tree, from there up, we had BDAs. I wouldn't like to put them down the meadow, but we had BDAs up above there. But, we're flooding that meadow early in the season when the water's high, when we got a lot of water. Changes the whole vegetation community when we do that. We're seeing new willows come out in that meadow. I'm holding, that's a sedge, I believe it's Carex utriculata. Over in the right-hand picture, those fuzzy-headed deals, that's a juncus, that's Juncus ensifolia, and we actually got a cattail coming there. So, since 2015, when we first put the beavers in, this is what's happened. And every year we were going and counting the dams. We were so excited to see beaver dams that we were keeping track of how many we had. So in 2018 we had 117 dams. 2019 we had 140 plus. And we've got enough now, we don't bother to count them anymore. But my guess is we're well over 200. Are they reproducing? Yeah, we've got on our game cameras, we've got there's a kit in the left and the edge of that picture on the left. There's another one there in that photo on the right. And there, one of my cameras caught a baby riding on an adult. So they're reproducing, perpetuating the species in our watershed. We had a picture on the left. We had a gauge in there to measure the pressure transducer is what it was, to measure the flow in the stream. And this was above anywhere that we thought we'd see beaver activity. But the beavers moved up there and actually flooded it out, or diverted the water away from it, I guess, is basically what they did. And we've also realized that in the wintertime, the beavers, they make snow caves and lodges. Right? We've seen it in several places. When the snow melts, you'll see cuttings and field sticks and one thing and another where they've been in a snow cave alongside the stream. You see in this picture on the bottom right, some of those stumps are 5-6 feet. We don't have beavers that are that big. That's just, they're out there in the wintertime on the snow, cutting those. And they stay active somewhat in the winter. They don't hibernate. So they have to have a food source. And they will have a food cache in their pond come fall. You can always tell where they're going to spend the winter by where that food cache is. But I guess when it's exhausted, or maybe they get bored being in the lodge, they'll venture out, and you'll see these stumps that are 5 and 6 feet tall. Now, this is our graph that I showed you earlier. Now the orange dots is since we reintroduced the beaver. So on average, we've got 42 days longer flow. Why is that? When a beaver dams up the stream, we get storage in the pond, but we also get a lot of storage in the ground adjacent to the ponds, and that all gets saturated in the spring of the year with the high flows. And that water, it's moving downstream, so to speak. Doesn't move near as fast as the water does in the channel, but it'll eventually work its way downstream and get back into the channel, and that's what helps maintain that flow through the dry season. We've heard a lot the last couple of years about flattening the curve. This is a hydrograph, I think it was in Europe somewhere, but you see the peaks of the flow in when we have a high flow event or cloud burst or whatever, and the flow out, how it's modified. So we see reduced flows during the peak event, but we see increased flows after it's over. So that's how it works. The beavers, they've been flattening that curve for a lot longer than we have. This is a picture of my granddaughter. She caught this. We have Bonneville cutthroat trout in this Birch Creek, and they're a pure strain. They've done the DNA work on it. And they're not listed, but they're considered threatened. And we've seen quite a response in the Bonneville cutthroats. This one, we never used to see anything more than 4 or 5 inches long. She caught this one out of one of those beaver ponds. The Forest Service, they did an electrofishing survey in 2001 and again in 2012. And they found less than 4 of those fish per 100 meters. Now we put the beavers in, and they did the same survey in 2019, and now we're finding in the beaver dams, we're finding over 150 feet of fish in 100 meters. In the unimpounded areas, we're still up around 20 fish per 100 meters. So the fish response has been really, really fantastic, and it's really a byproduct. That wasn't our goal. Our goal was to try and extend the flow, but the fish deal, it's become really important to me. I'm pretty tickled about the response that we've got from the fish. So here's a couple of books if you're interested in beavers and want to learn more about them. Eager by Ben Goldfarb, and Ben actually came to Birch Creek when he was researching this book, so you can read a little bit about Birch Creek in there. really a good write about him that he's written about beavers. And another good one is by Ellen Wool. She's from, I believe, out of Colorado State University, Saving the Damned. So if you're interested in beavers, there's a couple of pretty good reads. And also this low-tech process-based manual. That's, if you want to learn how to build BDAs and understand all the science that's involved in this, this manual will tell you all about it. It's available on Amazon, but it's also available online. If you just go in and Google that, you can download a PDF version of it. So it's available online. But it's about 250, 300 pages, and it's full of material. So I have folks ask me, how come you go to all this trouble? And, I found this quote in a book that I read a few years back, and this pretty well spells it out. So that's, I got to talk. We had a lot of fun building these BDAs and doing all this, and we kidded each other all the time. In 2015, there was a presidential campaign. And these guys from Utah State, they showed up one day and they had this hat. It's not Make America Great Again, it's Make Rivers Great Again. So I'm kind of tickled to have that. We did have a lot of fun. Now, questions?
Wonderful. Well, Jay, thank you so much for sharing your story of Birch Creek with us. I can really see as you're thinking about your pull to this land and really needing to come back after 30 years and why you were back there and it's in your blood and what a beautiful place to be. And I can think of words that I was thinking of as you were talking were persistent and collaborative and creative and reflective and ingenious. So I really appreciate you sharing your story with us today. And also, if folks don't know, Jay, we have a lot of gratitude for him also as sharing part of his story with us for our exhibition that is now in the galleries called Beavers, or Damn It, Beavers and Us, and that really explores the interplay of humans, beavers, and the landscape. And so I invite folks to come and see that exhibition until October 3rd. And I'm also encouraging folks to add some questions into the comments section or into the chat feature right now. And we do have a few questions that have come in. One that Jay came in kind of midway through the program was, how'd you know how to do all of these things? So you were talking about cottonwood and you were there's doing a lot, wondering how you figured this out. Were you self-taught?
Yeah, I've tried to educate myself. I'm more of a reader than I am a TV watcher, and I don't like to read novels. I like to learn stuff. So I had researched all this. Pretty basically, I'd been self-taught. I don't have a degree. I wish I did. I'd be a lot more credible when it comes to knocking on these agencies' doors and one thing and another. But I feel like, I've learned enough that I know and I understand what's going on. So, yeah, I'm pretty much just self-taught.
And I can see that your connection to land and the work, this is definitely something I can appreciate. So thank you for sharing. One of the other things that folks were wondering was, have you noticed any other changes on the creeks with other wildlife in addition to the fish? So increase of diversity of birds, ungulates.
Yeah, we're seeing. We actually had a pair of mallards that nested on one of those beaver ponds, and we're seeing a lot of moose in those ponds.
Oh, wow.
The fish is the big thing, but in order to support the fish, you've got to have insect life and one thing and another. That's all been magnified since we got the beavers in there. It just creates more habitat for the insects, the songbirds. the other day I saw one of those dippers. I don't know what they call them, but I'd never seen one of them in that area before. So, yeah, it changes a lot of stuff. The beavers are, they're considered a keystone species, and they create habitat for a whole bunch of critters.
Definitely, and I appreciate that you were talking about when your childhood you saw them as a nuisance and a pest, and your mind has been changed over the years. And one person's asking about what people can do to advocate for restoring beavers in watersheds, even if we live in the city with or without our own streams.
Yeah, well, there's people around and organizations around that are the whole sentiment about beavers is starting to change, and a lot of people they've had an epiphany like I did over my coffee, and they're starting to, the whole attitude toward beavers is starting to change. And there's organizations out there that are pro-beaver, and they're actually doing some of this PDA work and one thing. I know it's going on here close around Bend. So Beaver Works Oregon, get involved with those folks and go volunteer and help.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, and Bonnie's saying ONDA, Oregon Natural Desert Association, builds BDAs. Another question that's coming in has been that you work with a lot of different agencies, and would like to know if your work has become a model for BDAs and work elsewhere. And other folks are wondering, are other ranchers replicating your work?
Yeah, we had to work really close with the Forest Service, because most of this watershed, all this BDA work was done on Forest Service property. The NRCS has actually got a program, and something wildlife, Working Lands for Wildlife or something, and they actually can fund this work on private land. So, and yeah, it's catching on. I've got, there's actually two of my neighbors, one on a creek that's 3 or 4 miles south of our ranch, and then another on the next creek, another 2 or 3 miles. They're actually doing what I've done. They're building BDAs and wanting to get, so it's catching on in my neighborhood too. So yeah, as far as the agencies, the Fish and Game went along with us. They got us the beavers. The only other agencies is the ones I got in trouble with when I took all the cottonwoods out. But the Department of Water Resources, they have to give you the permit.
Right.
But in the beginning, they were somewhat skeptical on this deal, but they're starting to see the results. Actually, the Forest Service has actually now bought all that equipment, that post pounder and everything, and they're doing it on their own. So, yeah, it's catching on.
That's great. One person wants to know, how are the cows doing?
Well, considering the year, our calves are looking pretty good. I don't think the cows are coming in looking slick and fat and yummy, and they got big old calves with them. So I think we've survived this drought year.
That's good.
We did have one problem. We had lightning hit a tree with 4 cows in it. We had 4 cows killed by one lightning strike. So other than that, everything's been pretty good.
And one person has given a plug too. Do you that you're going to be speaking tomorrow at the Crook County High School Performing Arts tomorrow night, and it's sponsored by Think Wild, Beaver Works, and the Crooked River Watershed Council at 6 p.m.
Yeah.
If folks want to learn more.
It's going to be the same show. So
yeah, great.
A different audience, maybe.
Same program. And we are, for folks recording this, and it will be up on the museum's YouTube link as well, so you'll be able to share that with friends and colleagues. And if there are no other questions, I want to thank Jay for his time so much, and also let folks know about our next Natural History Pub that's coming up next in October, and just letting people know that that will be a virtual program again. And it is Bobby Bruno, the General Manager of the Natural Resources and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, is going to present Homeland, Treaty, and Culture on Monday, October 4th at 7 p.m. And he'll provide an overview of where the tribes have come from and the Treaty of 1855, as well as insights into the tribe's culture, sovereignty, management of lands both on and off reservation. And you can register for that today on the High Desert Museum's website. And I appreciate everybody being here tonight. Big thanks to Jay. I know everybody's doing clap from home, and thank you all for being here.